Let's be honest, there is a very specific moment people clock you as different when sports come up. It usually happens during small talk. Someone asks, "Did you catch the game last night?" And you pause, just a beat too long, before saying, "No, not really." Their eyebrows lift, their smile tightens. Sometimes they laugh like you've told a joke you didn't know you were telling. Other times they try again. "Oh, you're more of a basketball person," or "What about the playoffs?" And when you finally say, plainly, "I just don't really care about sports," the energy in the conversation shifts. You can feel it, a subtle recalibration, like you've just violated an unspoken social contract. In many cultures, sports aren't just entertainment. They're a language, a ritual, a socially acceptable way to bond, compete, release emotion, and declare loyalty without ever saying anything personal out loud. So when you opt out, when you don't feel that pull, that obsession, that emotional investment, it's rarely interpreted as a neutral preference. It's framed as a deficiency. You're missing out. You're not passionate. You're too intellectual, too sensitive, not competitive enough, or worse, boring. We've been conditioned to believe that caring deeply about sports is somehow synonymous with being fully human. That obsession equals vitality. That cheering, yelling, tracking stats and organising your emotional life around the performance of strangers is evidence of a healthy social identity. And if you don't do that, if your nervous system doesn't light up when a ball crosses a line, then something must be wrong. You must be detached, or elitist, or secretly judging everyone else. But if you're someone who doesn't obsess over sports, you already know the truth feels very different from that story. You're not numb, you're not passionless, you're not above it all. If anything, you often feel too much. You just don't experience meaning through proxy competition. And psychology has a lot more to say about that than most people realize. The world likes to frame sports obsession as universal, but it isn't. And the people who fall outside of it aren't broken. They're wired differently, often in ways that reveal a surprisingly sophisticated emotional architecture. To understand this, we have to start with something uncomfortable. Sports obsession is not really about sports. At its core, mass sports fandom is a socially sanctioned form of emotional outsourcing. It allows people to experience belonging, triumph, despair, rivalry, and identity without having to generate those stakes in their own lives. When your team wins, you win. When they lose, you suffer. But safely, collectively, with rules, schedules, and clear narratives. It's a controlled emotional roller coaster in a world where genuine meaning often feels hard to access. For many people, this is deeply regulating. For others, it's deeply uninteresting. If you don't obsess over sports, your brain likely doesn't respond strongly to vicarious identity. You don't feel compelled to merge your sense of self with an external symbol, a team, a city, a jersey, a legacy you didn't personally build. That doesn't mean you lack tribal instincts. It means your identity formation works differently. You're less inclined to borrow meaning and more inclined to construct it internally. Psychology sometimes refers to this as a lower susceptibility to identity fusion. That's the phenomenon where people experience a group's success or failure as if it were their own. Sports are one of the most socially acceptable arenas for this fusion, but not everyone's nervous system finds that appealing. Some people experience it as overstimulating, hollow, or oddly performative. And here's the part people rarely say out loud. For a certain type of mind, watching other people chase a goal you have no control over feels existentially unsatisfying. Not because you don't understand the rules, but because you don't feel the transfer of meaning. If that resonates, it's not because you're cold, it's because your brain doesn't confuse observation with participation. Now let's talk about attention, because this is where things get interesting. Sports fandom requires a very specific attentional style. It's externally focused, episodic, and emotionally punctuated. You tune in, you spike, you crash, you repeat. The reward comes in bursts. Goals, points, wins, highlights. For many people, this pattern is highly stimulating. It aligns beautifully with dopamine-driven engagement. But people who don't obsess over sports often have a different attentional economy. Their focus tends to be more continuous, immersive, and internally guided. Instead of spikes, they prefer depth. Instead of spectacle, they gravitate towards systems, ideas, narratives, or experiences that evolve slowly and reward sustained presence. This is why so many non-sports obsessed people find themselves absorbed in things that look quiet from the outside. Long conversations, creative work, reading, building, thinking, listening, refining. Their reward system isn't optimized for cheering, it's optimized for coherence. And coherence is not loud. From the outside, this can be misread as a lack of excitement. But internally, it's often the opposite. These are people whose emotional lives are rich but subtle. They don't need a scoreboard to feel alive. Their nervous system doesn't crave constant peaks. In fact, too much emotional amplitude, crowds, shouting, tribal aggression, can feel dysregulating rather than exhilarating. This brings us to personality. Research consistently shows that people who are less interested in sports fandom tend to score higher in traits like openness to experience and introspective processing. They are more likely to seek meaning through abstraction, symbolism, ethics, aesthetics, or personal growth rather than dominance hierarchies and competitive outcomes. This doesn't mean they dislike competition. It means competition isn't where they source identity. For them, the question, "Who are you?" isn't answered by allegiance. It's answered by alignment. What values do you live by? What ideas move you? What kind of attention do you bring to the world? These are slower questions. They don't chant well in stadiums. They don't fit on merch, and because of that, people who don't obsess over sports often grow up feeling slightly out of phase with the mainstream. Not alienated, just misaligned. They learn early how to nod along during conversations that don't move them. They learn how to translate, "I didn't watch the game" becomes "I was busy because I wasn't interested" feels socially risky. Over time, this can create a quiet sense of otherness. Not dramatic, just persistent. Like living in a culture that's always celebrating a holiday you don't observe. But here's the reframe most people never get. This distance from sports obsession often correlates with a heightened sensitivity to authentic engagement. People who don't obsess over sports are often highly attuned to whether something feels real to them. They have a low tolerance for ritual without resonance. They don't easily adopt emotional scripts just because everyone else is following them. Their nervous system asks, almost automatically, "Does this actually mean something to me?" When the answer is no, they disengage, not out of superiority, but out of honesty. This trait can be costly socially, but it's powerful psychologically. It means your emotional energy isn't easily hijacked. You're less likely to outsource your identity to institutions, symbols, or narratives you didn't choose. You're harder to market to, harder to rally, harder to manipulate with tribal rhetoric. And that makes some people deeply uncomfortable. Because sports obsession isn't just personal, it's political, cultural, and economic. It's one of the last universally accepted forms of mass emotional coordination. When someone opts out, it subtly threatens the assumption that this is what passion looks like. That intensity must be loud, that loyalty must be visible, that emotion must be collective to be valid. You challenge that simply by existing. There's also an empathy angle that rarely gets discussed. Many people who don't obsess over sports have a strong aversion to zero-sum emotional frameworks. Sports, by definition, require winners and losers. Triumph is inseparable from defeat. For some nervous systems, that's invigorating. For others, it creates a low-grade moral tension, not in a preachy way, but in a visceral one. If you're highly empathetic, you may find it difficult to fully celebrate victory, knowing it necessitates someone else's loss. Even when the stakes are just a game, your emotional system doesn't fully compartmentalize that. You feel the imbalance, the aggression, the ritualized hostility, and while you may intellectually understand it's symbolic, your body doesn't experience it as neutral. This doesn't mean you can't enjoy competition. It means your empathy doesn't turn off easily. Interestingly, many non-sports obsessed people do enjoy activities that involve challenge and mastery, just not as spectacle. They're drawn to participation over observation, creating rather than watching, practicing rather than cheering, learning rather than chanting. They'd rather do the thing than identify with someone else doing it. This is why you often see them deeply invested in crafts, skills, personal fitness, music, art, philosophy, entrepreneurship, or niche intellectual pursuits. Their sense of fulfillment comes from agency, not affiliation. And then there's the nervous system piece, the part that explains why sports culture can feel not just boring, but actively draining. Stadiums are loud, crowds are volatile, emotions swing fast. There's alcohol, shouting, confrontation, and ritualized aggression. For people with highly sensitive or reactive nervous systems, this environment can push them into overstimulation quickly. What others experience as excitement, they experience as chaos. These individuals aren't weak, they're perceptive. Their sensory intake is higher resolution. They notice the undercurrents, the tension, the performative masculinity, the social pressure to feel something on command. So they step back, not because they can't feel, but because they feel too precisely to enjoy emotional noise. Now let's address the unspoken accusation that often hangs in the air, that people who don't obsess over sports think they're better than everyone else. In reality, it's often the opposite. Many of them have spent years minimizing this difference, deflecting questions, or pretending mild interest to avoid social friction. They know how quickly disinterest can be interpreted as judgment, so they learn to soften it, to say, "It's just not my thing," instead of, "It does nothing for me." What's actually happening is discernment, not disdain. They're selective with their emotional investments because their inner world is already full. They don't need constant stimulation to feel alive. They don't need scheduled drama. They don't need borrowed victories to validate themselves. And here's a deeper layer most people never consider. For many non-sports obsessed individuals, identity isn't something to be defended, it's something to be explored. Sports fandom often reinforces fixed identities. My team, my rivals, my colours, my history. There's comfort in that, but for people oriented toward growth and introspection, fixed identities can feel constricting. They prefer fluidity, curiosity, evolution. They're less interested in declaring who they are and more interested in discovering who they're becoming. That orientation changes how everything lands, including sports. Now let's talk about the social cost. Not obsessing over sports can subtly limit access to certain conversations, relationships, and professional bonding moments. Games are a common social lubricant. They provide a ready-made script. When you don't participate, you sometimes get left out. Not maliciously, but automatically. This can be painful, especially early in life. It can create the false impression that connection requires conformity, that to belong you must perform interest. But over time, many people who don't obsess over sports develop something else instead. Depth-selective relationships. Fewer but more resonant. Less frequent but more real. They bond over ideas, values, humour, vulnerability, shared curiosity. They don't connect by shouting at the same screen. They connect by seeing each other. And that brings us to the quiet truth at the centre of all this. People who don't obsess over sports are often deeply relational, but in a non-broadcast way. Their emotional lives don't scale well. They're not built for mass synchronization. They're built for attunement. They notice tone shifts. They read subtext. They feel when something is off. They care about how things land, not just how they look. This makes them excellent listeners, thoughtful partners, careful thinkers, and ethical decision makers. But it also means they can feel out of place in cultures that equate volume with vitality. So when someone says, "I don't get how you don't care about sports," what they're often really saying is, "I don't recognize your way of being alive." And that's okay, because aliveness doesn't have a single frequency. Now, before we close, there's one more thing we need to talk about, and it's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. In a world increasingly built on distraction, outrage cycles, and emotionally engineered spectacles, the ability to not obsess is a form of psychological autonomy. When you can choose where your attention goes, when it isn't automatically captured by the loudest collective ritual, you retain a level of inner sovereignty that's becoming rare. You're not immune to meaning, you're intentional about it. You don't confuse stimulation with substance. You don't mistake intensity for importance. You don't need to borrow emotional arcs when you're already living one. And that doesn't make you disconnected, it makes you anchored. So if you've ever felt strange for not caring who won, for not remembering stats, for not understanding why everyone's mood hinges on a game, you're not missing a piece. You're expressing a different configuration of wholeness. You're someone who experiences meaning internally before expressing it externally. Someone who values resonance over ritual. Someone whose passions don't always translate into chance, but shape how you think, love, and live. This channel exists for people like that, for those who've quietly navigated a world that celebrates spectacle while they search for substance, for those who've learnt to honour their own attention, even when it doesn't align with the mainstream. If this gave language to something you felt but never quite articulated, you're in the right place. We're not here to tell you what to care about. We're here to understand why we care the way we do. And I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. When did you first realise sports just didn't do it for you? What does capture your attention in a way nothing else seems to? Let's talk about the forms of passion that don't come with jerseys. Thanks for being here. And remember, your depth doesn't need a crowd to be real. It just needs to be yours.